listening to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to Hotel Bar Sessions, everybody. I am Lee Johnson, and I'm joined by my regular and fabulous co-hosts, Bob Valier and Jen Kling, and today we are going to talk about drugs. We've got a special guest with us who you'll hear more about in just a second, but before we do that, let's get some drink orders and let's get some tunes to put on the jukebox. Jen, what about you?
Good evening. Tonight, I'm going to have a margarita, and on the jukebox, I'm listening to Another World by Medusa and Hala.
We're drifting in silence, destined to collide. This love lasts forever, just get lost in time.
I'll find you in another world, we're drifting in silence, destined to collide. And that's sometimes what I think about when I'm doing my drugs of choice, just drifting around. It's kind of how it feels. So that's what I'm having this evening.
Bob, welcome back to the bar. What are you drinking?
Well, tonight I'd like to have a painkiller, which is a mixture of rum, pineapple juice, and coconut water, I guess, in equal parts with a splash of orange juice. It'll make me feel like it's the summer. And on the jukebox, I want to select from the 1979 album Fear of Music by the Talking Heads, the track Drugs.
Girls are worried, girls are shy. Get the sound, let it pop. Nobody knows what they're talking about.
This is, of course, a fantastic album. It's their second best. Their best is Remain in Light. This track, like most of the tracks on the album, the lyrics don't make any sense at all. So it kind of reflects drugged experience, maybe. But in any case, one line from there is, all I see is little dots. You have to imagine this in a David Byrne voice. All I see is little dots. Some are smeared and some are spots. It feels like murder, but that's all right. Somebody said there's too much light. Put down the shade. It's all right. It'll be over in a minute or two. That's how you survive.
Well, I see you have a guest there with you. Why don't you introduce him?
I do. This guest is a fantastic addition to our bar crew tonight. His name is Justin Smith-Ruiu. He received his PhD from Columbia University and is currently a professor of the history and philosophy of science at the Université Paris Cité. He's also held visiting appointments or been a research fellow at Princeton, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and the Humboldt University in Berlin. He cut his teeth as a scholar of Leibniz and early modern philosophy, but his philosophical interests are diverse and eclectic, as one can see in his Substack called The Hinternet, which started as a blog back in the days when blogs were a thing. It was always interesting to read, as you might encounter there a mix of Norse mythology, Slavic etymology, and some obscure text on the parts of animals by a forgotten medieval monk, all in one paragraph.
Wow.
He's achieved what has eluded many in our profession, which is the ability to write in an accessible but still intellectually rigorous manner, which is on display not only in his Substack, not only in the New York Times, Slate Magazine, Wired, and Cabinet Magazine, to which he frequently contributes, but also in his many books, which include Divine Machines, Leibniz and the Sciences of Life, Nature, Human Nature, and Human Difference, Race in Early Modern Philosophy, The Philosopher, A History in 6 Types, Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason, and The Internet is Not What You Think It Is. Very eclectic, as I said. One more fun fact about Justin. He has an asteroid named after him.
That's amazing.
Welcome, Justin. What are you drinking?
I'll have a 20-ounce plastic bottle of Diet Dr. Pepper, as I always do, pretending I'm in the United States anyway. I'm a teetotaler, so it has to be strictly non-alcoholic. So that's my drink.
Cool. I think the bartender can help us out with that. And what would you like to put on the jukebox?
I think I'm going to pick the 1976 arena rock hit More Than a Feeling by Boston. It's a classic jukebox song, and its lyrics have some resonance with the reflections in the book. And also, it's just corny and hokey as you could possibly imagine. And so that seems like part of the jukebox spirit.
Nice.
Lee, how about you?
I am going to have a Fireball and Diet Coke today. You know, that was my drink for a long time. I get embarrassed every now and then about saying it, but, you know, we're talking about drugs, so I feel like I can just say it today.
No, live your truth.
And my jukebox pick, I'm really surprised nobody else chose this already, is Afro Man's Because I Got High.
I was gonna go to class before I got high. Come on, y'all. Check it out. I could have cheated and I could have passed, but I got high. I'm taking it next semester, and I know why. Why, man? Yeah, 'cause I got high. Because I got high. Because I got
So
high.
good.
Good one.
You know, it's funny. The whole song is basically a Just Say No campaign. You know, he just kind of goes through this whole day where everything goes wrong because he was high. But for all of us that listen to this in high school or in college, it doesn't really have that message. I don't think that the message was
Right.
don't do drugs. I think
Right.
all of us really loved that song, and especially loved that song when we're high. So thanks, Afro Man, for the song.
Right.
So as we've mentioned, today our topic is drugs. Bob, this was your idea, and I'm so glad that we've got Justin here to talk with us about it. But why don't you set up the conversation for us?
Sure. Well, you know, maybe it's the weird mindset that one needs to grasp a complex philosophical concepts, or maybe it's the unfortunate and not totally untrue Hollywood stereotype of the philosophy major as a stoner. But from the ancient Greeks to the counterculture of the 50s and 60s to today, drugs have had a long and strong association with philosophy. And sometimes, too, with the study of religions, particularly but not exclusively Eastern religions. Some philosophers relatively recently in the history, like James and Benjamin and Sartre, have published philosophical reflections on their use of drugs, done, of course, for research purposes only. And today, psychedelic research has once again become the object of serious scientific and academic interdisciplinary research, largely as a way to treat mood disorders such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but also, as the philosophers might say, in itself, as a way to investigate, for example, the hard problem of consciousness, because the psychedelic state represents an altered or alternative form or modality of consciousness. One might argue that psychedelic drugs dissolve the ego and various ego structures that ordinarily and normatively govern our relationship to and our perception of reality, whatever that is. They change our perception and experience of time and temporality, space and spatiality, and other minds, embodied or not. Once we're able to step outside our normative, ego-based, and largely binary modes of thinking, we may be able to experience, perceive, and even think otherwise. And this in turn may open up new philosophical perspectives, new conceptual frameworks to better understand who and how we are in relation to the world, to others, to reality and its various components. So that's why we're delighted to have Justin with us today, because his most recent book is called On Drugs, Psychedelics, Philosophy, and the Nature of Reality, and it explores exactly these themes. Dear listeners, it's time to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Get your drinks ready, pass the bong, and pony up to the bar. Today, we're taking drugs. For scientific research purposes only. So, Justin, your new book is, like all the other ones, totally fantastic and a really interesting read. Just as a teaser, I'd like to mention, in the classical period, ancient Greece in particular, drugs are already present in philosophy. The oracle at Delphi was very probably huffing methane, according to archaeological findings.
Absolutely.
And we know about the Eleusinian mysteries that Alcibiades very infamously profaned that probably involved the ingestion, most likely of mushrooms. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more from your area of delectation, modern philosophy, other historical tidbits about philosophers doing the kind of philosophical and scientific research that, of course, we are not endorsing at home.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Such an interesting point of entry to the conversation. I think, in a way, we might take our own ritual at the beginning of this podcast, ordering our imaginary drinks, as a sign that we're still living out the legacy of the early modern period, that we would default to alcohol. Well, I didn't default to alcohol. I defaulted to Diet Dr. Pepper, but it's kind of the expected, fully normal routine of groups of philosophers to alter their consciousness together when it's, one, downtime, and two, to do so using alcohol in particular. I know other things go on in the darker corners of the get-togethers of philosophers, but when it's more social, when it's more open, it's alcohol by default. I take it that the overwhelming preoccupation with alcohol as the consciousness-altering substance par excellence is something that takes root, or that begins in philosophy only in the 1600s with the rise of early modern philosophy and what we think of as rationalism. Things could have been very different if Locke or Descartes, for example, had taken fly agaric as the substance of choice to pursue thought experiments about altered consciousness. But the great difference between the early modern period and ancient philosophy, which you started out with, is that a high premium is placed, most famously with Descartes, but with other philosophers as well, a high premium is placed on wakefulness and sobriety. So the task of the philosopher, as it's now understood, is to be absolutely certain that you are, for one thing, not dreaming. Why? Why not take dreams as revelatory or as a guide structuring your life, as an aid to practical wisdom? We know many cultures around the world do this. What is so scary about dreams? That's a huge question, but it's safe to say that from the 17th century on, it becomes absolutely imperative to make certain that we are not dreaming and also that we're not hallucinating. Like, for example, to reassure ourselves that a reed sticking out of a pond is in fact straight, even if it looks crooked. And, anodyne examples like that I think are part of a general complex that also precludes the possibility of taking seriously other forms of radical alteration of consciousness, like self-induced via the consumption of botanical or fungal substances, or later chemical ones, and so on. The possibility of doing that not just on your downtime from philosophy, but as an aid to philosophy, goes against the entire spirit, the entire project of modern philosophy as it's conceived from 1640 or so on. And then some centuries later, you mentioned William James with nitrous oxide. We could also talk about Sigmund Freud. There's a wonderful book by Mike J. called Psychonauts, focusing primarily on James and Freud, if not in philosophy in the narrow sense, let's say, in the pursuit of natural philosophical insight, or what would later be called scientific insight. People like James and Freud, up to the late 19th century, are still able to take drugs and to write about it in their journals, insofar as they're men of science, right? But then even that gets foreclosed for the most part over the course of the 20th century that we can talk about soon enough.
James and Freud are literally doing it for scientific purposes.
Yeah.
They're conducting research on themselves to see what these experiences are like.
It's exactly like the citizen science of someone like Benjamin Franklin, who sees there's a storm outside, so he runs out with his kite to shock himself and to learn more about electricity. We lose that in the 20th century, in the natural sciences, certainly, because it doesn't follow the proper method, but in the human sciences, the social sciences in particular, with the rise of behaviorism, your own particular experience under the influence of nitrous oxide or hashish or whatever becomes utterly irrelevant to the advancement of science. So now some philosophers continue to do it, but they do it in, let's say, a more literary or experimental vein rather than in a positive vein, for better or worse. The one analytic philosopher I was able to identify who openly wrote about experiences with mescaline between 1925 and 1975, a guy named J.R. Smithies, was also an experimental psychiatrist and neuroscientist. So does he count as an analytic philosopher? Well, he better, because he's the only one we've got who was openly writing about this. And other than that, I mean, we can presume some of them did have experiences, but it was, again, the kind of thing one has to sweep under the rug in exactly the same way from the 17th century on. The main line of rationalist philosophical inquiry requires us to sweep dreams and other marginal or liminal cognitive states under the rug. And so part of my interest is not necessarily to say I have dream revelations or I've seen the face of God or anything like that, but just to say, you know, in what's ultimately my own kind of skeptical and rationalist disposition, why draw the line there? It's part of human experience too, right? And there's a certain understanding of philosophy where, you know, anything that's part of human experience needs to be tackled, whether it's an experience that pulls you further away from the truth or not.
I'm so glad you brought up this rationalist project of early modern philosophy, because my initial question is, how do we distinguish between what we're calling drugs and what are mind-altering substances, but we don't necessarily think of as drugs?
Yeah.
Because I often say to my students, my drug of choice is coffee. Now, I definitely think that's a mind-altering substance.
Yeah.
It alters my mind so that I am able to function in the world of cause and effect. But that is not what we mean.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's really important because, in a sense, the narrow focus of the book is a particular class of drugs that can be well defined at the molecular and phenomenological level. Psychedelics. But there's a significant discussion also in the book of the ultimate conclusion one has to draw, that drug is not a natural kind. There's no necessary and sufficient criteria for calling something a drug. And this is, I think, significant to the extent that the category is very much an artifact of early modern global trade and of the standardization of exchangeable units of various resources extracted mostly from the American colonies. So a drug literally comes from the Dutch adjective. It even sounds the same for dry. A drug is a standardized, measurable unit of any dry, exchangeable good.
Wow.
Right? So coffee is in if it's still dry, or, you know, if it's still in grain form or ground, but not once it's a liquid, right? And this is, I think, important because, you know, we still have all of these metaphors like spice for synthetic cannabinoids or for the stuff they harvest or mine in the Dune series. But actually, for a long time, you could easily imagine a 17th century Dutch trader referring to cinnamon as a drug, right? Because what's important is not that it blow your mind. What's important is just that it, I suppose, be exchangeable in standardized units, that's one thing. But secondly, that it be supplementary to the basic necessities of life. And, there are wonderful historians like Sidney Mintz, The Sweetness of Power. It's a classic work on the role of sugar in colonial history. And, he makes a really good point that, all of the commodities that drove the mad race for the Americas, and in particular, well, gold and silver, that's one thing, but, so many of the other commodities are luxuries, are things people got by just fine without in the ancient world, right? Like sugar, silk, coffee, and so on, chocolate. These are things people don't need, but are perfectly ready to plunder and kill for nonetheless. And that's a very interesting fact. So drugs then historically sit in that conceptual space, I think, more than in the conceptual space, again, of mind-altering substance. And I think the kind of narrowing of the notion is rather recent. In fact, it comes with, I think, the Nixon drug war, which little by little, at least in American English, makes us default to pharmacy rather than drugstore, right? Because drug now has taken on this very negative connotation. And part of that connotation is that it clouds your mind, right? And that, I think, is a relatively recent addition. But again, part of the fact that it's not a natural kind grouping is connected to the fact that, as you point out, coffee does something to you, and yet we all can agree that it does something very different to you. But what it does is also something that's very culturally shaped, right? Different cultures will have different interpretations of the effect of one and the same substance. This is something that Levi-Strauss was particularly interested in, the use of mushrooms by Norse berserkers before they put on the bear sark and went and raided Norman villages.
Wow.
So clearly they thought that psilocybin was something that helped you be ultra-violent, if that's what you want to be. There are plenty of North Asian cultures, by contrast, that use it ritually for meditative or visionary purposes, where violence is the furthest thing from their mind. So what does psilocybin do exactly? Depends a lot on culture. I think we know what coffee does. On the other hand, my dad used to drink coffee when he had insomnia to go to sleep, right? He was like, I can't sleep. I'm going to drink some. Wait, does Bob do that too?
I do, yes.
I don't understand.
I mean, this is one thing that I hadn't fully appreciated before I really started reflecting on this for the book, is that the cause and effect kind of bare neurophysiological or molecular story behind what any given substance does is really just the beginning of the story. There's a lot more that always has to be said about culture and context.
I want to ask you a different kind of classification question. And I want us to bracket for a second that 19th century psychonaut tradition, which was really just treating drugs as instruments for mapping consciousness.
Yeah.
I want to ask you instead about something that you said before, which is that some of these drugs bring us closer to truth or aim us more directly at truth or something like that, and others don't. Because we've talked about a lot of different drugs. I mean, obviously coffee and alcohol, mescaline, hashish, nitrous oxide, cocaine with Freud.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about a lot of different drugs, and we know that those have very different effects on our experience and our bodies.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have in your own mind or some argument for which of those drugs are more amenable to philosophical reflection, which of them aim us more towards truth, and which aim us further away from that.
That's so interesting. I suppose I should say I'm among those philosophers who are not really prepared to make any bold claims about the nature of truth or whether I myself have access to it. And so I would just say a lot depends on what you mean. I mean, there's a sense in which Adderall could bring you closer to the truth because it can help you stay all night to study your philosophy books, which will bring you closer to the truth, right? And so that's one sense. Wine might be an aid to a really good conversation that will bring you closer to the truth. But obviously, I think when we're talking about the first ever arrival at some profound realization that we at least subjectively feel like calling truth, I think it's safe to say that a drug classified as a psychedelic might be more useful than Adderall towards that end, right? But whether that feeling is communicable, I think, is a really important question. And it's why I hold back a bit and I remain skeptical. I do continue to have enough sympathy with the rationalist tradition to think that if you discover some inner truth, but you find that it's inexpressible, it's probably not worth that name. It's probably not worth calling it a truth. And, I mentioned at some point the definition of the mystic as someone who has experienced something ineffable and won't shut up about it. Right? And one doesn't want to fall into that trap. I think someone like Aristotle is very good at going right up to the edge of expressibility when he's kind of limbing the boundaries of our world, specifying what it would be like to be the unmoved mover outside of that as pure thought, something like that. But then he doesn't say, and here's my own pure thought or anything like that. So he's a good model of a philosopher who can go up to the limit of expressibility and go no further. And that's kind of where I feel like I should stay myself. So then part of the challenge of this book for me was to say, hey, there is this really interesting experience that a lot of human beings have. In fact, we seem to naturally be inclined to seek this experience out. Bob mentioned ancient Greek drug usage, but there's also plenty of archaeological evidence from the Upper Paleolithic. I mean, it's old. You have to conclude that it's species-specific behavior. So we've always sought this out, so it's really important. It's also extremely hard to talk about because it kind of makes us bump up against these limits.
Hey there, dear listeners. Everybody agrees that the best time of the conference is after the conference is over and we're all hanging out in the bar having discussions. It's our social hour. And speaking of being social, you should be following us on social media. You can find us on Blue Sky, YouTube, and Facebook. And in all three of those places, we're at Hotel Bar Sessions. So please follow us on social media and keep the social hour going.
Justin, what I am thinking about while you're describing your process of writing your book and how folks have thought about drugs throughout history, and especially the philosophical approach, I'm reminded of the early modern understanding of metaphysics, actually, which is this notion that what we're doing when we're doing metaphysics is trying to get at the underlying structure of the world. And then the question, of course, is how do you best do that?
Yeah.
I take it that the rationalist project was you best do that by getting, as you said, as sober as possible.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. But then I take it there's this other approach, which is to say our sobriety limits us in certain ways. Maybe we would do better to engage in this seemingly species-wide behavior. Can that, to borrow a line, open the doors of perception? That's a line from Ken Kesey.
Yeah.
And allow us to really see the underlying structure of reality. Is that a good way to think about this philosophical approach?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if I can return once again with you to the 17th century.
Always.
One of the figures I'm particularly interested in is Locke and his idea of the definition of personal identity as continuity of memory. He says that, at least, rigorously speaking, if you get blind drunk and you go out and kill someone, it wasn't you who committed the murder. Nonetheless, and this is the significant part, nonetheless, from the point of view of the law, The law is limited in how much it can know what's going on inside of you. So it's normal to hold you responsible anyway. You can't imagine a jurisprudence that would come up with a way to measure how continuous your personal identity is throughout a crime or something like that. That is interesting to me in part because it's an example of the tension between kind of the limits of philosophical engagement with subjective experience and the way we need to manage human behavior in society, no matter what's going on inside of us. So one of the questions I like to ask in the book is, again, and I do this with Descartes as well, what if, fly agaric would have been an obvious choice. In fact, I think there's strong evidence of only lightly euphemized use of fly agaric in Kepler's Somnium, where he describes a transit to the moon via consumption of a magic potion. I think that must be a description of consumption of what would now be an illicit substance. He invokes his mother, who is at the moment of writing the treatise. His mother is in prison on charges of witchcraft. So it's quite likely that Kepler gives us an example of early modern psychedelic drug use influencing philosophy in a broad sense, at least natural philosophy. But then with Locke and with Descartes, an interesting question to ask is, what if they had availed themselves of one of these substances? It's also conceivable that someone could have brought back ayahuasca by this time. Certainly Jesuits in Central and South America knew about it. What would their intuitions about, say, the continuity of personal identity have been if the interruptions of personal identity or the weird kind of off-the-charts oscillations in the flow of personal identity, what if those oscillations had been caused by something other than mere alcohol, right? I think that's an interesting counterfactual. And so, I kind of toy with it in a section of the book called The Psychedelic Meditations of René Descartes. But the fact is, it's very discordant with what early modern philosophers were actually saying, Kepler aside, to the extent that, again, they weren't trying to go out to the edges of experience and see what could be learned there about human consciousness. They were, so to speak, trying to take the easiest case. And you still see that a lot in standard analytic philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Someone like Ned Block, I can remember him saying, well, let's just focus on the red dot on the screen now, because that's a simple case, right? And one of the problems with that is, sometimes simple cases are so simple that they leave out a lot of the other interesting stuff we might want to know about. And, part of that experience, it doesn't have to be induced by psychedelics, but part of what, a test case in the examination of what consciousness is that just focuses on what it's like to see a red dot on the screen is all the heavy, metaphor-laden, affective weight that each of our individual consciousnesses might bring to that experience. You're telling me to just look at the red dot, but I'm seeing some distant memory of my 7th birthday or memory of my grandfather or whatever. And one way of thinking about mind-altering substances like psychedelics is that they really, really turn up the dial on metaphorical and affective overlayerings that we might bring to Ned Block's red dot on the screen, right?
Right, to borrow from Quine, not deserts but jungles.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Again, the idea is, and again, I do a lot of work in the book to kind of dissociate myself from any possible suspicion of wanting to play the role of the psychedelic guru. I really don't want to do that. I don't know where I stand on a lot of much discussed issues like the use of psychedelics in psychiatric therapeutic treatment, acceptance, legalization. I'm pretty moderate and judicious in the way I approach those issues. The only thing I want to insist on is that it does kind of force an awareness of a whole range of cognitive and subjective capacities that we have. Once you become aware of those, the emphases and the primary focus of most of the reflection on what consciousness is in philosophy starts to seem pretty narrow and pretty limited to a few paradigm cases that don't really tell the whole story.
I want us to try to nail down a little bit more the relationship between philosophy and the philosopher on drugs.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about these interruptions in subjectivity or unraveling of subjectivity that happens in the experience of some drugs, first of all, people experience that differently, and people experience that differently with different drugs. I mean, for a lot of people, there's a kind of dissolving of subjectivity that happens with psychedelics. That wasn't my experience. A lot of people think there's a kind of dissolving that happens with weed. Also not my experience. My experience is that speedy drugs make me feel not like myself. I hate speedy drugs in general, despite the fact that, you know, my three primary drugs are like caffeine, nicotine, and adrenaline. I don't think that we can count adrenaline as a drug in the same sense. But at any rate, the point is there are definitely drugged experiences that we have where we don't feel like the kind of agential subject that we normally associate with the philosopher or the philosopher doing philosophy, whatever that means. Often when people describe the experiences they have under these influences, they might say something like, this happened, you know, in the passive voice.
Yeah.
And it makes one wonder whether or not there are certain drugged experiences where we might say philosophy is happening, but there's no philosopher there. There's no philosopher doing philosophy. And that seems to me an important distinction. And we might want to set that apart as something else.
So interesting. I just got really excited when you mentioned adrenaline, because one of the things I discuss in the book is another thought experiment kind of motivated by some studies that suggest that rats produce trace amounts of DMT endogenously, and that in principle, you know, at least in principle, that suggests that you could imagine a species like human beings in every respect, except they have this additional capacity to endogenously produce LSD, so that they're just naturally tripping all the time, right?
Wow.
Aren't there like frogs that do that? You know, there's frog lickers.
Oh yeah, but I'm not sure the frogs get to enjoy their own secretions. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that.
They're not high on their own supply.
Exactly, yeah. In a sense, your brain is always on drugs, no matter what, right? There's always a chemical story to tell about why you are perceiving the world in a certain way. And some drugs, like melatonin, really are endogenously produced, and we just add more of that to help us regulate our sleep cycle or whatever. So I started out with the claim that drug is not a natural kind. It really gets difficult to give a neat definition when you're comparing not just, say, coffee and ayahuasca, but when you're comparing, say, adrenaline and coffee and ayahuasca, right? And I really don't think there's a good argument for excluding adrenaline in all cases. So that's just one point. Now, getting back to the other aspect of what you were saying, indeed, you know, I appreciate your report about your own experience, because what one always has to say is, indeed, results vary. And people have profoundly different experiences. And also, there's the added problem that the experience of, say, ego dissolution can, in some cases, be a hair's breadth away, or even somehow perfectly parallel with the impression that you are the Lord and sovereign of all creation. You know, you can have these two experiences running together. It's like, am I nothing or am I everything? And really be uncertain as to which characterization gets closer to the nature of the experience. So then you come out of that and you try to talk about it. That's going to get really hard, and willy-nilly, it's going to look a lot less like the sort of explanation we see in a rigorous peer-reviewed philosophy journal that most people would like to see. Inevitably, it pushes you in the direction of paradox and metaphor and poetry and away from arguing from premises to conclusions, right?
But just quickly to get back to the philosophy question, when I sleep, when I dream, that is, whether that's because I took something or because I endogenously produced it, like melatonin, I'd make a distinction between dreams and what philosophy is. You know, and of course I can talk about my dreams. I can explain my dreams, or at least some of them, to someone else. And I may be able to explain the meaning that was found in those dreams. I think that would be philosophy.
Right.
But we say that dreams are not philosophy. It's not as if philosophy is happening in this other state.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what I was trying to get at when I was asking, what is still philosophy once the ego is in question, we'll say, or being interrupted?
That's a super interesting question, I think. And Bob mentioned my 2016 book, The Philosopher, A History in Six Types. And part of the reason why I decided to do that typology is because the term is used in many ways, right? And 10 years later, I think I'm less certain than ever about what counts as doing philosophy. I think I'm fairly close to the definition and the tradition that would have it that, you know, you have to be able to formulate your position and arguments and give reasons for that position. And that's something that would come after some experience that resists that kind of treatment, like you say, dreams do. I'm in general inclined to go along with that. I certainly talk to my students as if that's how I understand philosophy, because I don't want to look like I've gone off the deep end. On the other hand, we know that there are many kind of boundary practices in many different philosophical traditions, in different places and times, including classical Greece, where there's a much more flexible notion of what can be included under the broad umbrella of philosophical inquiry, and that can include oneiromancy and consulting oracles and things like that. And, you know, who am I to judge? That's my basic take on all of this. Philosophy is a cultural practice, and different cultures will do different things.
That was a really good answer to Lee's question, and I want to just add a couple of things to it, starting with a revelation that will come as a surprise to absolutely no one. I have done a lot of drugs.
Bob, I'm shocked, I tell you.
There's gambling in this establishment.
Who knew? A lot of psychedelic drugs in particular, and continue to do them in various guises, whether it be as the guru, as you pointed out earlier, or just simply for psychotherapy. It has done wonders for me psychotherapeutically, but it's also, I think, done wonders for me philosophically, not simply because it helped me understand ecstatic temporality in Heidegger, which it didn't. But, you know, there is something that happens in the psychedelic experience where there is like a breakdown of binary thought, or a breaking down of binary thought, a release of sort of the standard normative structures of thinking and conceiving the world, a release also of deeply embedded prejudices and presuppositions that we carry with us and that sort of govern how we interact with the world and interact with others as well. But one thing that they have really helped me to do is sort of deconstruct and reconstruct the meaning of meaning, which, if I wanted to put that less cryptically or weirdly, might just simply be a kind of value shift happens, you know, pre and post psychedelic experience. When you experience this kind of ego death and you release these prejudices and presuppositions that you have, then you see the world and what is valuable to you in the world in a fundamentally different light.
Yes.
And you can sort of give up, for lack of a better phrase, how did the old dictum go? It's time to put away your toys. It's time to put away childish things and become an adult, even though probably adults don't spend their weekends doing mushrooms. Well, some don't.
No judgment here.
No judgment. But in any case, I think that's where the stoned philosopher, as it were, the philosopher on drugs is at work, sort of after the fact.
Yeah.
Not during the experience itself, but after the fact, reconstructing philosophical frameworks, conceptual networks, etc. There's a wonderful story about Foucault tripping balls in the desert and how it fundamentally altered his late project on the history of sexuality.
Absolutely, yeah. You can see that.
You can sort of see the philosopher at work in stories like that and experiences like the one I am risking reporting on the air. I hope the police don't come after me.
Fascinating. No, certainly it's really important for the uninitiated to understand that there is a kind of lifelong hangover, so to speak, or afterglow maybe, and that it, I think in many cases, alters your fundamental values and priorities in irreversible ways. And as far as the empirical studies show, this is usually for the better. I think there might be some cases where people report the reverse, but in general, I think your experience, as you report it, is empirically the norm.
Hey friends, Jen Kling here. If you like what we do at Hotel Bar Sessions and want to support the show, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Your support helps us keep our conversations going, literally. It covers the behind-the-scenes costs of producing the podcast and lets us carve out the time and space from our days to keep talking about the big ideas that matter. So if you're able, head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. Sign up at any level and become part of the Hotel Bar Sessions community. If you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, or several one-time donations to our podcast, you can also do that through Venmo, Cash App, or PayPal via our website, hotelbarpodcast.com/support us. We appreciate every bit of support, and we're genuinely grateful that you're at the bar with us. Here's to more great conversations.
I'm actually really interested in these reports that the younger generations, Gen Z, Gen Y, are using less drugs, drinking less, doing a lot of other things less than we did. And I'm wondering sort of why that is the case or what that reveals about drug use that is important maybe to notice. I suppose one approach to that could be that if you're living in a time in a society in which there is a lot of precarity, in which you literally can't trust your eyes and ears about what you see, in which truth itself is so shaky, there might be a greater aversion to mind-altering drugs in particular. I am curious whether or not that's at least part of it. But also, I think some of it has to do with the social nature of drugs.
Yeah, of course,
I mean, all the way down to alcohol and coffee. I mean, drugs are almost never an entirely individual affair, either because they're often done together with other people or because they definitely affect other people, right? They affect your family, your relationships, your coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. Do you have any insights about why the kids are off drugs?
They've just got a harder drug, namely scrolling. I mean, the simple truth, I think it's nothing more complex than that. They're all screen addicts. And I mean, it's funny, the way we talk about brain rot now, as in like AI brain rot, is remarkably similar to this is your brain on drugs rhetoric from the 1980s.
True, yeah.
Both are to some extent true. They are dangerous. But I think the simple explanation is that the overwhelming drug of choice is one that extends the metaphorical scope of the notion of drug further. You know, I'm not such an expert on the science of addiction, but certainly doom scrolling is at least as addictive as psychedelic drugs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question. There are other hard drugs that are more addictive. And of course, there's still plenty of lives ruined by drug abuse, you know, drugs that are just drugs of desperation, like OxyContin and so on. We have to be maybe careful about which demographics we're looking at and so on. But I think, you know, the best explanation I have, and again, I'm no expert of what you've mentioned, the trends among young people is just that we live in a screen-mediated world now, and everyone's hooked on it, and they're atomized and alienated, and we're all hikikomoris at this point. So that's the bad news. But I'm happy if teen alcoholism or teen alcohol abuse are, statistically down. I think on balance, that's a good thing.
I'm glad you mentioned OxyContin in particular, not because I'm a fan, quite the contrary. It and alcohol, too, are depressants. They are painkillers. So they literally shut off your affective system, how you perceive yourself, how you perceive pain, how you perceive the world. In psychedelic, the word psychedelic has to do with the opening of the mind and the play of the mind. So there is a category difference between those kinds of, as you called them, drugs of desperation that really sort of kill curiosity, kill affectivity, kill pain, and psychedelic drugs, on the other hand, which are mind expanding in some way or another.
I discuss this critic of Aldous Huxley from the 1950s in the book. His name was R.C. Zener, and he put it very nicely. Alcohol awakens drives, psychedelics awaken capacities. And I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about the difference. On the other hand, again, I think these classifications are extremely variable, that yes, there's some basic neurochemical bedrock fact of the matter about what alcohol does to a person. On the other hand, alcohol, say, the sip of wine consumed as the blood of Christ, that might gently quicken the spirit and give a person a feeling of being suddenly co-inhabited. You can't say, sorry, no, you're wrong, that's a depressant, right? You're mistaken about the phenomenology of this, because actually alcohol is a depressant. And in fact, I've seen countless conversations with teens, including myself when I was a teen, where adults try to convince teens that alcohol is a depressant, so they shouldn't be drinking it to party. And the kids are just like, whatever, man, this is a party. So, these classifications are interesting, but I think rather limited. And I think, again, overall, the basic neurochemical fact is that psychedelics are much more well-suited to the awakening of capacities than alcohol is.
Well, as you said before, the experience of drug use is not just about what happens in your body. I mean, it is cultural, it is social, it does have something to do with your own psychology, etc. I mean, it reminds me a lot of Derrida's choosing the word pharmakon from Plato.
Yeah.
Every drug is both a poison and a cure.
Yeah.
And I think that to the extent that it leans one way or the other, to the extent that it leans more towards the therapeutic or more towards the destructive, has to do not primarily with physical attributes, what it actually does to your body, but has to do with how it is worked into your social or political or cultural milieu.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, where there's criminalization and stigmatization and everything happens on the down low, inevitably the social processing of what is happening inside of one is going to be very different.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to ask a question. You talk about this in your book as well. For some people who indulge in psychedelics, there is for them a kind of reinvention of the divine, particularly if they might be tuned into Eastern mysticism, etc. There's someone like a Terence McKenna, for example, the guy who came up with the stoned ape theory about human evolution, but also developed a sort of anti-Christian eschatology based on psychedelic experience. So that's an idea of reinventing the divine. But in your case, through your research, you've reconnected with the divine in a more traditional way. You report, both in your book and in interviews around the book, that you have sort of rediscovered Catholicism. So I'm curious, why? What do you think about the psychedelic experience led you to this sort of reconnection with particularly Catholic divinity?
Okay, there's so many ways to approach this. Let me approach the question of psychedelic experience and Eastern religious beliefs, broadly speaking. I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the polar difference between the Abrahamic religions and what emerged historically in East Asia. There might be times and places in East Asia over the past few millennia where schools of thought or traditions develop that emphasize aspects of human experience that look more amenable to a person post psychedelics. But on the other hand, you can find the same things in all the Abrahamic faiths if you look hard enough. An interest in paradox. And for me, what's most important and what's at the core of Christianity, now that I've kind of returned my attention to it, is mystery. The truth of Christianity, if you're prepared to call it true, is fundamentally and kind of irresolvably mysterious. You know, and the notion of mystery has an old theological signification, and I'm not sure I fully understand it. I'm not a scholar of it, but part of the experience is just shifting my perception of religion from that doesn't make any sense, therefore it must be really stupid and only stupid people believe it, to that doesn't make any sense. Wow, this is the profoundest thing I've ever encountered, right? Being able to make that shift, I think, is a really big change for me over the past years. And, you know, I look back on my decades of kind of staunch reductive materialism and I kind of cringe at my own self-presentation. Like, my goodness, what ungrounded haughtiness, you know? And I just can't quite make sense of it. But then I guess finally the question, why Catholicism? There I would just say, I think this is something that one, or at least I don't want to make any generalizations, but I would have been approaching it in an erroneous and misguided way if I had somehow supposed that religious commitment is something you choose the way you choose your brand of toothpaste. You know, looking at the huge variety in the aisle, you know, that's where I was baptized. That's where I had my first plunge, like literally speaking. So that's where I ended up. I mean, you can probably tell by the way I speak, I'm pretty ecumenical and I'm pretty keen on interfaith dialogue and dialogue between the faithful and the non-faithful. It's like I tend to be very attracted to Simone Weil's cryptic observation, each religion is alone true. It's ambiguous in both French and in English. I take that to mean a kind of cat henotheism, right? Like it's true insofar as you're considering it alone. Well, here's the one I'm taking alone, right? That's kind of how I would put it. So it's not relativism, but it's also not I'm right, you're wrong, dummies. You know?
Well, unfortunately, our bartender is cutting off our drug supply of alcohol, and so we are going to have to roll out of here. But this has just been a really fascinating discussion. And Justin, I'm so glad that you are here with us tonight. I want to give everyone a chance to give us your last thoughts before we get out of here. Bob, let's go to you first.
I got two last thoughts. One is just an annoyance. Listeners may not know this, but when we record, before we record our sessions, we always prepare an outline. And then we ignore it for the most part. There was so much juicy stuff in the outline, so much stuff that we just did not have time to cover because the conversation takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And that's great. But the second observation that I have is one of the things that we didn't talk about much, except for my reference to it, is psychotherapy. So I just want to say this as a nod to the power of psychedelics. Mushrooms absolutely, undeniably, totally cured my depression. I suffered from very severe depression for decades. And sometime after my mother died, after the grieving period was over, I didn't microdose. I macrodosed
Good for you.
mushrooms, and then it was gone.
Wow.
I mean, and that was 10 years ago, and I have not been depressed since.
Amazing.
So there is something to say for the psychotherapeutic aspect that we barely even nodded to.
Good for you.
Yay, mushrooms. Jen, what about you?
My last thought is that I just want to continue this conversation because, Justin, when you started talking about your post-research, going back to Catholicism, I cannot help it, my friends. I immediately think about Karl Marx. Religion is the opiate of the masses.
Yeah.
And then I immediately want to continue this conversation and start talking about not only religion and drugs, but religion as a drug and how these things interrelate in our social political milieu. So I just want to keep talking.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can do a part two at some point. But yeah, what I would say there is, well, maybe Marx is onto something. But then in that case, so much the better for opiates. I mean, in a sense, one can't deny, or I can't deny the power of the metaphor. Yeah. What we do with that in turn is a difficult question.
That's where all the good philosophy comes in.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess my final thought was, because I think the audience for this podcast is mostly philosophers and philosophy students, for me, this book was a kind of letting my hair down sort of moment, which was a lot of fun and really important. So, I guess my final words are just kind of advice, like don't wait, because it feels good once you start doing it, and it doesn't have to involve drugs. It can involve some completely other topic. But I think there's really something to be said for what I think of now as kind of doing philosophy with your whole person, which is how I wrote the book. I wrote it in a first person, self-exposing kind of way that requires a certain amount of confidence and also recklessness. And there are reputational costs. But in the end, I think it's the best I've ever done for myself, at least kind of situating myself in a broader intellectual community. Like, people know who I am now and everything's cool, right? The stress of it is over. So my last words are a bit of advice.
Well, Justin, this has just been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we can have you back later to talk
that'd
about
be great.
your Catholic opiate addictions.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Oh, man. Good night, everyone.
Let's go take drugs and do crime.